This video is created for educational and awareness purposes only. All events are based on.
In April of 1985, Chicago police and federal agents thought they had already won. They had a man in cuffs, a warrant executed, a case built on months of surveillance, and they believed, like they always believe, that the moment the cell door closed, the danger closed with it. They were wrong. Because the man they had just locked inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center in downtown Chicago was about to prove something that federal prosecutors would later stand up in court and call brazen, far-flung, and enormously profitable. His name was Roosevelt Daniels. And what he built from inside a federal detention cell, using nothing but a payphone bolted to a concrete wall, would go on to become one of the most audacious drug operations Chicago's federal courts had ever documented, not alleged, not rumored, documented in black letter law in two separate federal appellate opinions that still sit on the books today. This is the story of a man the system thought it had already beaten, and the empire he ran from inside the walls that were supposed to stop him. To understand how a man behind bars could still command an entire cocaine distribution network across Chicago's streets, you have to go back further than 1985. You have to go back to a young Roosevelt Daniels on the streets of Chicago in the early 1970s. A man reportedly already comfortable with violence long before drugs became his business. In 1970, he was convicted of battery and unlawful use of a weapon. The following year, 1971, came armed robbery, a conviction serious enough that he served 5 years behind bars for it. For most men, 5 years is supposed to be a wake-up call. For Daniels, according to court records, it was reportedly just the beginning. In 1976, not long after his release, he was convicted again, this time for aggravated kidnapping. Court documents describe the offense in stark terms. Daniels abducting 2 people at gunpoint and stuffing them into the trunk of a car. 2 human beings forced into a trunk at the mercy of a man who by this point had already shown Chicago exactly what he was capable of. This was not a man drifting into crime. This was a man building a resume of violence, one conviction at a time, each one darker than the last. And then he went quiet, or at least the official record goes quiet, the way it often does with men who are learning, not stopping. Because when Roosevelt Daniels resurfaces in federal court, documents nearly a decade later, he is no longer the small, time-armed robber or the kidnapper working with a gun and a car trunk. He is something else entirely. He is the architect of a large-scale cocaine distribution ring that federal investigators say operated across Chicago from July of 1984 through September of 1985. 14 months. 14 months of product moving through the city, of money changing hands, of a network expanding under a man who by every measure should have already been marked as too dangerous, too violent, too well documented to build anything at all, but he built it anyway, and it worked until, in April of 1985, federal agents finally caught up with him. Here is where the story most true crime channels would end the chapter: arrest made, case closed, justice on its way. But federal court records tell a very different story, one that reads less like the end of a criminal enterprise and more like its second act. Because according to the criminal complaint that led to his pretrial detention hearing, Daniels wasn't just distributing large quantities of cocaine. He was doing it, prosecutors alleged, through an operation that included bribing police officers to obtain protection. Read that again: not evading police, not running from police, paying them, buying cover from inside the very system meant to stop him. An FBI agent testified at that detention hearing about the nature of the operation and a magistrate judge, reviewing the evidence, found there was probable cause to believe Daniels had committed serious federal drug offenses. Given his history, the armed robbery, the aggravated kidnapping, 2 people zip, tied into the reality of a car trunk almost a decade earlier, the magistrate concluded he posed a danger to community if released. Daniels introduced no evidence to rebut it. He appealed the detention order anyway, arguing he wasn't a flight risk because he was, as the court noted, a lifelong resident of Chicago where all his family lived. The courts weren't buying the argument that a man with roots in the city was somehow less dangerous because of it. If anything, his ties to Chicago were part of the problem. He apparently returned to the city over and over again to commit crimes, and police had no trouble finding him each time. The detention order stood. Roosevelt Daniels stayed locked up at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, awaiting trial. And this is where the story turns into something federal prosecutors would later describe using words rarely seen in court opinions, brazen being one of them. Because Daniels did not wait quietly for trial, he did not spend his detention writing letters to his lawyer or preparing a defense strategy in isolation. According to the federal appellate record, while awaiting trial on the very drug charges that had landed him inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center, Daniels continued to direct his cocaine distribution enterprise from his cell. Federal investigators would later establish that he did this in part through telephone calls made to his co-defendants on the outside, ordinary phone calls made from a facility designed to hold men who were considered too dangerous to release, using a system that was never built to stop a man from running a business through it. While the Metropolitan Correctional Center's walls held his body, they did nothing to hold his operation. The empire kept moving, the money kept flowing, the calls kept going out. It is worth sitting with how audacious this actually was, stripped of any Hollywood exaggeration, because the real version needs no exaggeration. This was not a shadowy criminal mastermind operating some elaborate smuggled communication network, no hidden phones, no elaborate contraband setup uncovered in a raid. This was, according to the documented court record, a man using the facility's own telephone system, the very infrastructure meant for detainees to call attorneys and family to keep a multi-defendant cocaine distribution conspiracy alive and expanding. 5 defendants would eventually be charged in connection with the operation Daniels orchestrated. Daniels himself, along with co-defendants identified in court records as Fitzgerald, Lee, Campbell, and 1 more. The federal indictment against them detailed an operation so extensive, so clearly proven, that when the case finally reached its conclusion, the appellate court reviewing it did not mince words. The evidence of guilt, the court wrote, was overwhelming. Every one of the 5 defendants ultimately pleaded guilty. There was no jury trial verdict to argue over, no reasonable doubt to exploit. The evidence spoke for itself, and it spoke loudly enough that 5 separate people facing the rest of their lives in federal prison chose to plead rather than fight it in front of a jury. But the guilty pleas were not the end of the legal battle. Daniels and his co-defendants later moved to withdraw those pleas, hoping to reopen the case, to find some procedural exit from what was coming. The motion landed in front of United States District Judge James Holderman. Judge Holderman denied it. And in 1989, 4 years after Daniels had first been locked inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center for allegedly bribing police officers, 4 years after federal investigators believed he had used a jailhouse payphone to keep an entire narcotics operation alive, Judge Holderman handed down the sentences. They were, in the words of the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals reviewing them on appeal, exceedingly long. Daniels received a sentence that would keep him behind bars for decades, reported in different court filings as a term reaching up to 55 years, with a separate Supreme Court filing referencing a total term of 40 years imprisonment to be followed by a life term of special parole. Whichever figure you anchor to, the message from the federal courts was unmistakable. A sentence with no realistic expectation of walking free again. His co-defendants received their own long terms, one reportedly sentenced to 20 years followed by a decade of supervised release, another to 15 years followed by 10 years of special parole, another to 12 years followed by 5 years of probation. And notably, because of the nature of federal sentencing at the time, these terms were not subject to parole. Every year handed down was a year that would actually have to be served. The Seventh Circuit's language when reviewing all of this on appeal is almost jarring in how directly it confirms everything that sounds, on its surface, like it should be an exaggerated true crime narration device. The court did not dance around what Daniels had built. It called the offenses brazen. It called them far-flung. It called them enormously profitable. These are not words a federal appellate court uses lightly. These are words used by judges who have reviewed the raw evidence, the wiretap records, the testimony, the financial trail, and concluded that even by the standards of federal drug trafficking cases moving through Chicago's courts in the 1980s, this operation stood out. It stood out for its scale. It stood out for its organization. And it stood out, above everything else, for the fact that its architect ran a meaningful portion of it from inside a federal detention facility, using a telephone that was never supposed to become a command line for a criminal enterprise. The appeal itself, once it reached the Seventh Circuit, did not focus on whether Daniels was guilty. The guilty pleas had already resolved that question, and the evidence, as the court noted, was overwhelming regardless. Instead, the defense fought over a technical but serious legal issue: the validity of the federal grand jury that had indicted them in the first place. Federal law places an 18-month limit on how long a grand jury can remain impaneled, unless a district court formally extends that period. Daniels and his co-defendants argued that the grand jury which indicted them had exceeded that lawful window, and that the indictment itself was therefore invalid, a legal argument that, if successful, could have unraveled the entire prosecution regardless of how overwhelming the evidence against them was. It is a reminder that even in cases this stark, even when guilt is essentially conceded through a guilty plea, the machinery of federal law still has to be checked, still has to be defended, procedure by procedure, motion by motion. The case would eventually be pushed as far as a petition for writ of certiorari to the United States Supreme Court, the defendants' last realistic shot at overturning what had happened to them. The government's brief in opposition to that petition laid out the timeline in blunt, unforgiving language. From July 1984 to September 1985, petitioners, led by Daniels, operated a large-scale cocaine distribution ring in Chicago. After his arrest and detention on narcotics charges in April 1985, Daniels continued to direct the enterprise from his cell at Chicago's Metropolitan Correctional Center. The Supreme Court, reviewing the petition, declined to disturb what the lower courts had already found. The sentences stood, the convictions stood, the findings stood. What makes this story so unsettling, even decades later, is not just what Daniels reportedly did. It's what it reveals about the limits of a system that is supposed to be airtight the moment handcuffs go on. There is a comforting fiction, one that shows up constantly in how the public thinks about incarceration, that a cell is the end of the story. That once a man is behind bars, whatever he built on the outside collapses without him. that criminal enterprises are fundamentally personality-driven and die the moment their architect is removed from the streets. Roosevelt Daniels' federal case is one of the clearest, most legally documented rebuttals to that fiction that Chicago's court system has on record. He did not need to be on the streets to run a cocaine distribution ring across the city. He needed a phone, a network of people willing to take his instructions, and enough time before the system caught up with the reality of what was happening. Federal investigators reportedly needed to build an entire secondary case just to prove what he was doing from inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center, layering wiretap evidence, financial tracing, and testimony from co-conspirators on top of the original narcotics case that had put him there in the first place. That is not the profile of an isolated, opportunistic hustler making a few desperate calls before trial. That is the profile of a man who understood with cold clarity that incarceration was an obstacle to be managed, not a wall that stopped him. It also raises a darker, more uncomfortable question that runs underneath every part of this case, one that the court record touches on without ever fully answering. How many others tried the same thing and simply weren't caught? The Metropolitan Correctional Center in Chicago was, in the 1980s, a facility holding hundreds of pretrial detainees at any given time, many of them facing serious federal charges, many of them with existing criminal networks on the outside that didn't simply evaporate because they'd been arrested. Roosevelt Daniels is the name that ended up in the federal reporters, the name that produced two separate published Seventh Circuit opinions and a Supreme Court certiorari petition, because his case got big enough, loud enough, and provable enough that prosecutors built an ironclad record around it. But the mechanics he reportedly exploited, an ordinary detainee payphone, family and associates willing to relay instructions, an operation flexible enough to survive its leader's physical absence from the street, those mechanics were not unique to him. They were simply, in his case, documented well enough to survive scrutiny all the way to the nation's highest court. There is also the matter of what came before all of this, the violence that, according to court records, shaped who Daniels was long before cocaine ever entered the picture. The 1976 aggravated kidnapping conviction deserves to be sat with, not glossed over as a footnote on the way to the more headline-grabbing drug empire story. Two people abducted at gunpoint, forced into the trunk of a car. That is not a crime of opportunity or a moment of panic that requires planning, restraint devices, or the threat of a weapon sufficient to force compliance, and a level of calculated cruelty that most violent offenders never reach. It tells you that by the time Roosevelt Daniels was orchestrating a multi-defendant cocaine ring capable of moving product across Chicago for over a year, he had already spent the better part of a decade proving, conviction after conviction, exactly how far he was willing to go. The battery and weapons charge in 1970, the armed robbery in 1971, serious enough to draw 5 years, the aggravated kidnapping in 1976, and then, waiting on the other side of that record, the cocaine operation that federal courts would eventually describe as enormously profitable. Each conviction reads like a rung on a ladder, and by the time federal agents caught up with him in April of 1985, he had reportedly climbed high enough to be running an operation that included, prosecutors alleged, paying police officers directly for protection, not evading the system anymore, buying pieces of it. What ultimately brought the operation down was not some single dramatic raid or a Hollywood-style takedown. It was the slow, grinding weight of federal investigative work, built case by case, wiretap by wiretap, until the pattern became undeniable. Investigators had to prove not just that Daniels ran a drug ring before his arrest, but that he continued running it after his arrest from inside a federal facility, which meant establishing a chain of evidence connecting his phone calls to specific actions taken by his co-defendants on the outside. That is a difficult, resource-intensive case to build. It requires patience. It requires cooperation from people inside the operation, or evidence solid enough that cooperation becomes irrelevant. And when the case finally reached its conclusion, the fact that all 5 defendants pleaded guilty rather than risk a jury trial tells its own story about just how solid that evidence turned out to be. The Seventh Circuit's description of overwhelming evidence was not a rhetorical flourish. It was a legal conclusion reached after review in a case where the defendants themselves had already effectively conceded the point by pleading rather than fighting. By 1989, when Judge Holderman handed down sentences reaching as high as 55 years for Daniels, the message being sent by the federal court system in Chicago was unambiguous. This was not going to be treated as an ordinary narcotics case, not after everything the record had shown: the prior violence, the alleged police bribery, and above all, the fact that detention itself had failed to stop him. Federal sentencing without the possibility of parole meant that whatever number was attached to Daniels' sentence, it functioned, for all practical purposes, as the rest of his natural life behind bars. The courts were not interested in giving him another chance to prove what he could do with a phone and enough time. And yet, even with a sentence that long, even with an appellate record this thorough, this case has largely faded from public memory outside the narrow world of federal case law and the neighborhoods that may still remember his name. There is no widely circulated retrospective, no major documentary treatment, no cultural footprint anywhere close to the scale of what Roosevelt Daniels reportedly built and ran in part from inside a federal detention cell using nothing more than a payphone. Compare that to how much attention has been paid to other Chicago organized crime figures whose operations, by any objective measure, were not more audacious than a man directing a cocaine distribution ring from a metropolitan correctional center telephone while awaiting trial on the very charges meant to stop him. The court record exists, the published opinions exist, the Supreme Court certiorari filing exists, laying out the entire timeline in the government's own words. And still, the story sits largely undisturbed in federal reporters, waiting for someone to actually read it and understand what it says. What it says, stripped down to its coldest, plainest terms, is this: a man with a documented history of armed robbery and aggravated kidnapping built a large-scale cocaine distribution operation across Chicago over the course of roughly 14 months. When federal agents finally arrested him in April of 1985 on charges that reportedly included the bribery of police officers, the system did what it was designed to do. It placed him in pretrial detention at a secure federal facility, specifically because a magistrate judge determined he was too dangerous to release. And from inside that facility, using its own ordinary telephone system, he kept the operation running. Federal investigators eventually proved it, built a case around it, and secured guilty pleas from every defendant involved rather than risk what a jury might do with evidence the appellate court itself would later call overwhelming. Judge Holderman sentenced Daniels to a term that, by any functional measure, meant he would never walk free again. The Seventh Circuit upheld it, the Supreme Court declined to intervene. And Roosevelt Daniels, the architect of an operation the courts called brazen, far-flung, and enormously profitable, disappeared into the federal prison system, his name preserved only in the cold, procedural language of appellate case law. Consider, for a moment, what the alleged bribery detail actually means once you sit with it long enough to feel its full weight. This was not a case where Daniels reportedly slipped an officer cash to look the other way on a single traffic stop. Federal prosecutors described an operation that included bribing police officers to obtain protection, not for one transaction, but for an ongoing enterprise. That word choice matters. Protection implies a standing arrangement, a relationship maintained over time, officers who were reportedly compensated not for a single lapse in judgment, but for a sustained pattern of looking away while a cocaine distribution network expanded across the city. If that detail holds up the way the federal complaint suggests it does, then the story of Roosevelt Daniels is not just the story of one man's criminal ambition. It is a story about how far corruption can bleed into the very institutions meant to prevent it, and how a network like this doesn't survive purely on fear and loyalty from the people running product on the street. It survives because somewhere, quietly, someone wearing a badge decided that looking the other way was worth more than doing the job. That context makes the eventual federal takedown even more significant. This wasn't simply Chicago police catching up with a local hustler. This was the kind of case that required federal agencies, the FBI among them, according to the detention hearing testimony, stepping in specifically because local enforcement channels were, allegedly, part of the problem the operation had learned to neutralize. When an FBI agent testified at Daniels' initial detention hearing about the nature of the crime, it wasn't a routine formality. It was federal law enforcement establishing on the record that this case had grown too large, too entrenched, and reportedly too compromised at the local level for anything less than a full federal prosecution to unravel it. The 18-month grand jury limit that Daniels and his co-defendants would later fight over on appeal wasn't a minor technicality plucked at random. It reflected just how long and how complex the federal investigation had to be to build a case airtight enough to survive appellate review, all the way up to a petition before the United States Supreme Court. And there is something worth sitting with in how ordinary the mechanism of his continued control actually was. No smuggled cell phone, no secret contraband device discovered in a cell shakedown, no elaborate scheme requiring outside help to breach the facility's communications security. Just a payphone, the same payphone every other detainee at the Metropolitan Correctional Center had access to, the same institutional phone line built for detainees to call lawyers, call family, call anyone on an approved list while they waited for a system that moves by design painfully slowly. That ordinariness is what makes the case so difficult to explain away as some singular anomaly. If a federal detention facility's own basic telephone infrastructure could be turned into the operational backbone of a cocaine distribution network capable of running for months without collapsing, the uncomfortable implication is that the tool itself was never really the vulnerability. The vulnerability was the assumption held by investigators, by the public, by the system itself, that detention alone was sufficient. Roosevelt Daniels' case is proof, preserved in published federal case law, that it wasn't. There's also the human toll sitting underneath all of this that court opinions, by their nature, rarely spend much time on. Behind every kilogram of cocaine that reportedly moved through Chicago as part of this operation were neighborhoods absorbing the consequences, addiction spreading through blocks that had already been worn down by decades of disinvestment, families fractured by a product whose profitability depended entirely on demand. The operation was actively working to sustain and grow. Behind the two people abducted at gunpoint and forced into a car trunk in 1976 were two human beings who lived through a level of terror that a court record can only gesture at in a single clinical sentence. The language of federal appellate opinions is necessarily bloodless, brazen, far-flung, enormously profitable, words chosen for their legal precision, not their emotional weight. But underneath that language sits a decade and a half of real harm done to real people. Harm that a 55-year sentence can acknowledge but never fully repay. The untouchable kingpin, the criminal mastermind pulling strings from behind bars like some figure out of fiction. But the truth here does not need that kind of embellishment, and reaching for it would actually cheapen what the record shows. The truth is quieter and, in its own way, more disturbing than any exaggerated version could be. A man built a violent record over the better part of a decade. He then built a drug operation significant enough to draw sustained federal attention. When arrested, instead of the operation collapsing the way the system assumes these things collapse, he adapted using the only tool available to him inside a detention facility, an ordinary telephone, to keep directing people who remained loyal enough, or dependent enough, or afraid enough, to keep taking his instructions. It took federal investigators building an entirely separate evidentiary case on top of the original narcotics charges, just to stop what he was doing from inside a cell. And even then, it took years from the April 1985 arrest to the 1989 sentencing for the full weight of the federal system to finally come down and close the door for good. It also forces a harder question about everyone who moved through that operation without ever appearing by name in a published opinion. Court records preserve the leadership, Daniels, Fitzgerald, Lee, Campbell, the men whose sentences were significant enough, whose roles were central enough to generate appellate review. But an operation described as far-flung, moving product across Chicago for over a year, required far more hands than 5 names on an indictment. Runners, lookouts, people trusted enough to relay a coded instruction from a payphone call without asking questions. Most of them left no trace in the federal reporters at all, their fates, whatever they were, absorbed into the ordinary churn of Chicago's court system in the 1980s, never reaching the level of scrutiny that transforms a case into published law. Roosevelt Daniels is remembered, to the extent he's remembered at all, because his case survived all the way to a Supreme Court certiorari petition. Everyone beneath him in that structure simply disappeared into the far less visible machinery of state and local prosecution. Their stories never assembled into anything resembling a documented record. Somewhere in that 4-year gap between arrest and final sentencing, Roosevelt Daniels sat inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center, awaiting a resolution he had to know, on some level, was not going to end well for him. And according to the very court records that would eventually convict him, he spent at least part of that time doing what he had reportedly always done, working the system, working the people around him, working whatever tool was in front of him, even if that tool was nothing more than a payphone bolted to a concrete wall inside a federal building in downtown Chicago. It is a story about violence, about the limits of incarceration as a solution, and about a federal court system that had to work extraordinarily hard just to prove what should have seemed obvious in hindsight, that a man capable of the crimes Roosevelt Daniels had already been convicted of was never going to simply stop being dangerous the moment a cell door closed behind him. The record is there for anyone who wants to read it. 2 published Seventh Circuit opinions, a Supreme Court certiorari filing, decades-long sentences handed down without the possibility of parole, and at the center of it all, a name that Chicago's federal courts still remember, even if almost no one else does.